So we'll be looking at page 29. Look at that first paragraph with me, and we'll kind of go from there. All right, first paragraph says, humility means not being conceited. It involves esteeming others first, above and before oneself. It includes looking out for the interests of others. It is the opposite of pride, arrogance, and self-righteousness. Sometimes I have my phone with me and I have my notes on there, and I'm getting a call for Roger. I'm not sure if he's having trouble connecting. Sorry about that. It says drop down to that to some of the bullet points that are said in there. One of the things that I think is most important about humility, if you look at that very last bullet point, look what it says: one who is humble is not afraid to admit when he is wrong. So that would be just in, I guess, any aspect of life. Somebody who's very prideful has a hard time saying, ooh, messed up here, didn't make the right call there, or maybe I didn't know something. I mentioned this past Sunday, I believe it was this past Sunday in my lesson, that one of my biggest frustrations with what has been going on in 2020, one of my biggest frustrations with what's been going on in 2020 is the fact that, I just didn't know what was going on with coronavirus, because you would get this information from the CDC, and then you would get somewhat different information from the WHO, and then sometimes the information would change from those places, and they would say, do this or don't do that. And it would be so confusing. And then our own government would have its own input that might have even been a third kind of option. And so there was so much confusion. And if you think I'm just kind of making that up, I read this article, and I thought about sharing it on here, but if you want it, I'll send it to you. I read this article that I think was updated August 1st. And it was basically a timeline of statements from the parties like CDC, WHO, our own government, our own states and stuff like that, different states. It was a timeline of statements coming from them that all had different information, all had different advice of how to handle it. And sometimes, like I mentioned, within the own CDC, it would change something. Now, I'm not here to make a political statement about coronavirus. The argument, though, that the article was making, I thought was very accurate. The argument was that, here's the thing: the reason that opinions change so much, the reason that people couldn't get on one single line of thought, one single train of thought, was because people were afraid to admit that they were wrong, or maybe even more than that, they were afraid to admit that they didn't know something. This was a pretty new virus in its own strain, and it was just how it was that maybe we didn't know everything that was going on with it. And some government, some leadership was afraid to admit that. And maybe we can be even understanding about that. People are looking to you for advice, strong, competent advice in health, in what we should do in our lives. And so they could get in a situation where, I don't want to admit I'm wrong, or I don't want to admit that I don't know something. So I just thought that was really interesting. Like I said, the article was not arguing what you should do, but arguing, just saying that, hey, this is the problem. People are afraid to say, I don't know. So a problem with pride, and I spent a lot of time on that, is just like that bottom bullet point right there, is it says, he who is humble is not afraid to admit when he is wrong. Continue reading on, under page 29, about the third paragraph. Humility is not thinking you are worthless. I think this is a good point to make here. Humility is not thinking you're worthless. If you were to ask somebody, Christians are just pushovers. Christians are people who don't have a backbone. I think the same paragraph will mention the word doormat. That's what a Christian is. Humility is not about that. It's not about thinking that you can't do anything. It's that you should just let people walk over you. We're all created in the image of God. We all have the same value. No one is better than me. And so that line of thinking should go, well, I'm not someone to be walked over, but that doesn't mean necessarily that I'm supposed to be walking over other people. That's this idea of humility. All right, so if you look at the screen, you see that little picture I put right there. Um, it says, "I am second." It was like this car sticker that I don't know when it became viral, probably about 10 years ago, something like that. Um, anyway, it was basically this sticker that people would put on cars, and it was meant to imply that they were Christians and that they were humble people. They were servants like Christ wanted them to be. Now, I'm sure a lot of people had good intentions with that. But do you see how somebody could perceive that as being a little hypocritical? Why do you have to announce to the world that you're the humblest person or that you are a servant like Christ wants you to be? Why do you have to have that on the back of your car? Why do you have to be announcing that everywhere? And so that was basically one of the controversies of it. A comedian who saw that pointed out, he said, you see those bumper stickers, he said, people saying they're second. He said, well, I'm going to one up them and I'm going to make one that says I'm third. So the point was that you could really portray the wrong message having something like this. And so you run the risk, even in your humility, of thinking, well, wow, I'm so humble, that you become prideful. So that's kind of what we'll be examining this evening. I want to look at a few things, and if you want to look at on screen, we're going to go through some verses pretty rapidly. Why should we try to be more humble and try to be less prideful? Well, here's the thing. There's a lot of good things that come with being humble. All right, for one, if you look at Psalm chapter 18, verse 27, I have it on my notes, so you don't have to turn there. We'll be reading these quickly. It says, "For you will save," talking about God, "He will save the humble people, but will bring down the haughty looks." Salvation comes that God looks at somebody who's humble, somebody who wants to be saved, probably, because somebody who's prideful probably doesn't want to be saved, and say, well, I'll bring you up and I'll put down the haughty looks. So salvation comes with humility. Guidance comes with humility. Look at, or I'll read what it says in Psalm 25. "The humble he guides in justice, and the humble he teaches his way." So that very last part, he says, the humble he teaches his way. I wonder if the reason that he teaches the humble his way is because the humble are the ones who are allowing themselves to be taught. I made a mention of this about 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, something like that, one of my lessons. But growing up, you think you know everything. You're not humble. You're not willing to be taught. You're not teachable. That is a sign of arrogance and of pridefulness. But a humble person is willing to be taught. So you get guidance not from just anybody, but you get guidance from God. Exaltation. So this is the part where I said, we should probably turn to Luke chapter 14. Go ahead and take out your Bibles. I do want us to look at the scripture because it is in our notes. It is in our material. If you turn the page, it's in the next page where he looks closely, the writer of this material looks closely at Luke chapter 14, particularly looking at verse 7 through 14. Now, this was all about who you hang out with, who you want to go, you want to invite to your house, so that way they invite you to their house, and you want the socialites, right? The rich people, the ones who carry some sort of weight in society. And Jesus tells them very plainly, you don't need to be like that. You don't need to look for the approval of men, or you don't need to do good things so that way good things are done to you. Pay attention to what it says, verse 10. "But when you are invited, go and sit down in the lowest place, so that when he who is invited you, he may say to you, 'Friend, go up higher.' Then you will have glory in the presence of those who sit at the table with you." So, we run the risk very much often of saying, well, I'm going to do this humble thing. Well, the teaching of the Lord was, okay, be more humble, sit at the lowly place. But when we do that, can I also say this? Because Jesus talks about it later on, don't let people know, don't let your right hand know what your left hand does. The good things that you do, don't damage them with pridefulness, with wanting approval. You don't want people looking at you for like that. And so as you say, as we continue reading verse 11, "Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted." And we have so many promises of that, don't we? That's not the only time it's mentioned. If you look at Matthew 23, Luke chapter 18, it is mentioned again 3 times in the Gospels. This idea, if you decide to be humble, ultimately God's going to be the one who exalts you. And finally, one of the greatest things about this idea of humbling yourself is that you have a home with God. Isaiah chapter 57 says in verse 15, "For thus says the high and lofty one," talking about God, "who inhabits eternity, whose name is holy. I dwell in the high and holy place with him who has a contrite and humble spirit." That's so oxymoronic that God is all the way, he's up here, and if you want to get up here, you got to be lowly. It's countercultural. We're not taught like that here in the world, but this is the teaching of God. All right. Just some of the things I think are good for us to look at and consider. This is the good things that come with humility. Now, one of the worst things, as a juxtaposition to what I just said about we get a home with God, one of the worst things about pride is that we don't have any home with God. So it's almost the exact opposite. If you look at what it says in Isaiah chapter 2, I'll read it again quickly. "The lofty looks of a man shall be humbled. The haughtiness of men shall be bowed down. And the Lord alone shall be exalted in that day. For the day of the Lord, Lord of hosts, shall come upon every proud and lofty, upon everything lifted up, and he shall be brought low." So if you compare those two passages there, and I were to ask you, because this would, Lord willing, soon we'll be able to be in a Bible class, I would ask you, who is the high and lofty one in those two verses? It's God. But God says that there's some people on earth who think they're like God. And he says, and on that day of the Lord, I'm going to bring them down. But the ones who are down here, I'll bring them up. So the thing with humility is I'm trying to make us see, is it something that we should constantly be striving for? But even then, we have to be careful that we don't taint the humility with thinking, oh, well, things are going good for me. People are going to like that I'm a humble person. People really admire humble people. They really do. Because it's something that's hard. But when they start talking about them, they're like, well, I like this praise that I'm getting. So it's a very hard balance to require and to attain. But this is what we're called to do. Now, I want us to look at pride a little bit, because pride is something that I would say the word I would use is insidious. Insidious means that something comes up, is built up, it's established without you even knowing about it. You know what's insidious in the real world? Cancer. Cancer is insidious. It is something that could be swelling up in you, could be killing you without you even knowing about it, and when you finally find out about it, you could be terminal. Cancer is insidious. Pride is insidious. It's something that I could have within myself and can completely go unchecked. And so I want us to look at a few things where pride becomes something that is just terrible. It's insidious. So look at what it says. Now we'll turn our Bibles to James chapter 4. James chapter 4. Look at some of the problems that come with pride. Look at what it says in James chapter 4. Begin reading there in verse 6. "But he gives more grace. Therefore he says, God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble." You want grace? You want forgiveness? You want an extension of God? Be humble. Continue reading on. "Therefore submit to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Lament, mourn, and weep. Let your laughter be turned to mourning, and let your joy be turned to gloom. Humble yourselves on the side of the Lord, and he will lift you up." Two things that I want to bring out. You see the point on screen, speaking evil of others is a work of pride. I'll get to that in just a second. But if you just look at this section that we just read, part of what comes with humility is saying, the things that I used to relish in as a sinner, I don't relish in them anymore. I've often heard, people being very proud of sowing their wild oats when they were young, people being proud of, not necessarily proud, but finding humor and laughter in the kind of life that they used to live in. I don't think that should apply as a Christian. Verse 7 through 10. You should be remorseful of the things that you used to do. You should humble yourself in the sight of the Lord. So that's part of it if you really want grace. Continue reading on, verse 11. "Do not speak evil of another." This is the problem with pride, brethren. Verse 11, he who speaks evil of brother and judges his brother speaks evil of the law and judges the law. But if you judge the law, you are not a doer of the law, but a judge. There is one lawgiver who is able to save and destroy. Who are you to judge another? 1 second, I'm adding a few people. This is the part where I focus on what's said there on screen. That this is something that speaking evil is a work of pride. Verse 14, verse 11 very plainly says, "Don't speak evil." You know why? Because you start judging by the law. Don't talk about somebody's sin because they're not as bad as you, or maybe you see yourself a little higher than them. And the risk that you're running is the fact that, oh, I'm a lawgiver, basically. I'm a judge of this person, a judge of anyone else, especially if it comes to be hypocritical. And in the argument that James is making here, James is making here in verse 12, says you're not the judge. There's only one single lawgiver who's able to save and to destroy. And basically the question is in verse 13, who are you to think that you're like that person? When you speak evil of a brother and you consider them lower than yourself, who are you to think that you're the judge? That's basically the idea that's pointed there. Now, the reason why I say that pride is insidious, it happens without us even knowing it. If you look on screen, it's titled Unrecognized Pride. How much does a little gossip go? How much does a little poking around Facebook, seeing arguments, seeing pictures, and then talking about it with your best friend? How much does that go on in our lives? Unrecognized sometimes. If I were to ask you right now, if I were to ask you, I'm about to tell a joke, who do you think the most humble person in the world is? If you say somebody else, but if we're being completely honest to ourselves, a lot of us would probably say, probably me. It's the unrecognized part of pride. There was this writer of a book that I forget what his name was, but it was titled The Top 10 Most Humble People in the World. And then it says, I'm going to explain to you why it's me and then the 9 other people that follow. This is unrecognized pride. Unrecognized pride is speaking evil of another person. Continue going on and look at the screen for the next point. It's also us being self-righteous. Because when you start speaking evil about a person, it makes you feel good. Do you get that point? It makes you feel better. And when we start to feel better, when we start to feel good about ourselves, we feel right. We feel righteous. And so you go to the passage in Luke chapter 18. So I'm not going to turn there. I believe you should have read it for your homework. Go to page 30. Just do me a favor and go to page 30. You should have already read this passage. You should have done your homework. And it's the second section, the very last one on page 30, where he examines, the writer of this material examines the Pharisee and the tax collector. Because this was a guy, the Pharisee was somebody who made himself feel good by thinking evil of someone else. And so the writer of the material asks, to whom is the Lord speaking in this parable? Well, if you read verse 9, he was speaking to people who thought themselves to be righteous. Because when you begin thinking and speaking evil of other people, that's where it leads you to be, right? So that's the problem with pride, that it goes unrecognized. Let's ask, who were the Pharisees? Well, they were the religious leaders of the day. Let me ask you, as somebody who believes in studying the Bible very fervently, somebody who believes themselves to be studying the Bible in a correct way, where do you find yourself in this parable? Are you something similar to a Pharisee? It says, question number 3, who is the tax collector? Obviously, this would have been a sinner, somebody who is humble, because in this parable, he recognized in himself, I'm not a good person. I need grace. I need, beat his chest. And then number 4 says, how did the Pharisee pray wrong? Well, here's the issue, how he prayed wrong. He obviously thought he was better than his brother. in those, easy questions, really, if you read the parable, easy questions, even if you didn't. The point here that I'm drawing is that when you begin to think and speak evil of others, it makes you feel good. And so that's where we come in and we read Luke chapter 18. Now, got two more points and then come to a close of this lesson. I want us to think about, instead of just unrecognized pride, I want us to now think about humility and how it can come up in uncommon ways. Go to John chapter 13. So let's turn our Bibles there. This passage isn't in our material, but I think it was good for us to read. In John chapter 13, as Jesus gets ready to wash the feet of his disciples. It says in verse 3, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going to God, rose from supper, laid aside his garments, and took a towel and girded himself. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel which he had girded himself with. Very famous passage about Jesus showing some humility. I mean, it was beyond Jesus, wasn't it? The reason I say this is uncommon is because we admired it in people. Obviously, this is the Son of God. This is deity being a man. And this is the ultimate example of it. Let me give you a very small example of a real-world person doing it. Perhaps you admire some of our presidents. Maybe you look up to one in Ronald Reagan. Maybe you admire who he was. I wasn't alive when he was, in the Oval Office, but from history books, I'm told, and I read that he was almost assassinated. And after his attempted assassination, he didn't feel well after his surgeries. He didn't feel well. So one night he got up from his bed and he went to his bathroom and he filled the basin of the sink with just a bunch of water, and he began splashing the water on his face. He didn't feel too good. He didn't realize, though, that he was actually spilling a bunch of water on the floor. And so he was kind of making a mess. Anyways, he began to get a paper towel and start cleaning it up. Well, at that time, one of the regular nurses was getting ready to do their hourly checkups on him through the night, and they didn't find him in bed, so they didn't sure he was. And they saw the light in the bathroom was on, so they went in. And this is actually a small article. The writer says that the nurse found President Reagan on his knees cleaning up the mess he had made. And when the nurse said something, she said, "Don't worry about that. I'll handle that." And he said to her, "No, this is something that is a mess that I made. I would hate for you to have to clean it up." That's uncommon humility for a lot of people. This was the guy, the reigning, leader in the world probably, and had this kind of humility. It speaks to a lot of his character in a lot of good ways. We admire that. So when we can submit ourselves to other people, submit our own egos. There was this other guy, I wrote his name down. I think his name is Pablo Casales. Let me tell you about Pablo Casales. I believe that's his name. If you don't know the name, that's fine, but he is renowned as one of the best cello players to have ever played the cello. And when he was 22 years old, he played the cello for Queen Victoria, okay? And then when he was 86 years old, he played the cello for President Kennedy, okay? One of the best celloists, best players ever to play the cello. All right, had a lot of prestige from the age of 22, 86. 10 years later, at 96, there was an interviewer asking him, "Why do you play the cello still 3 hours a day?" And his response was, "Well, I think I'm starting to see some improvement." That right there, that attitude of I can always improve, that I'm not better than somebody else, I'm not better than myself, is what Jesus was showing to the apostles. So continue reading on. I've kind of left the verses, but look at what it says in the verses. Verse 6. Then he came to Simon Peter, and Peter said to him, "Lord, are you washing my feet?" And he answered, he said, "What I am doing you do not understand now, but you will after this." Peter said to him, "You shall never wash my feet." Jesus answered him, "If I do not wash you, you have no part with me." Simon Peter said to him, Lord, not only my feet, but also my hands. Wash all of me, Lord. He says, you don't get it right now, Peter, but you're going to get it. So Peter says, wash me. So I wonder if this was coming to Peter's mind. Let's turn our Bibles to 1 Peter chapter 5 when he wrote this. Turn your Bibles to 1 Peter chapter 5. Look at what it says in verse 5 and 6. Likewise, you younger people, submit yourself to your elders. Yes, let all of you be submissive to one another. Let you be clothed. That's a big word, clothed. Kind of like how Peter said, how about you wash all of me? Clothed with humility, for God resists the proud but gives grace to the humble. Therefore, humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in your due time. I wonder if that was coming to Peter's mind. This idea of I'm not better than myself, I'm not better than other people, being submissive to another person. Now, let me show you in the church where this happened. Turn your Bibles to Galatians chapter 5, please. This will be the second to the last passage we read this evening. Galatians chapter 5. Look at what it says. I think there's an unfortunate chapter break in Galatians chapter 5 going into chapter 6. A lot of people would probably agree with me. But this idea of, pride just hurts us. It provokes people to doing bad things. It provokes you to sinning. But humility is the way to go. In fact, it restores people. Look at what it says in Galatians chapter 5, verse 25. If we live in the Spirit, let us also walk in the Spirit. Let us not become conceited. If you remember the very first part of our lesson, that's something that the writer said, not being conceited. Let us not become conceited, provoking one another, envying one another. Brethren, if a man is overtaken in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in the spirit of gentleness. Consider yourself, lest you also be tempted. Bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. For if anyone thinks himself to be something, he is nothing, and he deceives himself. So this idea of if you're prideful, you're provoking your brethren to thinking bad things about you, you're provoking yourself to sin. But if you're humble about it, and especially if you see somebody who's struggling with something, then you actually restore. Okay, so the 2 points that I've just made, this idea of uncommon humility. The first point, as we come to sort of the close of this lesson, that humility is something that God expects in us to be submissive, not only to ourselves, but to other men, other sisters in Christ, other people, in that if we are that humble person that we need to be, we actually fix relationships, we help relationships rather than hinder them and hurt them. I want to show us this evening where that is really exemplified to me. If you open your Bibles, go to Genesis chapter 33. Genesis chapter 33. If I were to ask you if Jacob was a good person in the Old Testament, some of you would probably say maybe, because we're not really sure. At the start of his life, he was given the name Jacob, somebody who would take somebody's place, supplanter, that's what that means. Kind of cheated his brother out of the birthright, or maybe deceived him or took advantage of him. Maybe that's the better way of putting it, in his time of need. Definitely lied to his dad, deceived his dad with the help of his mother. Not good at all. And you can imagine how much that hurt Esau to the point that he hated his brother. That's what the Bible tells us. And so for years they spend apart, and they're not talking. They're not living as brothers should. They're not being submissive to one another. They've had this provoked, angry relationship with one another. And then we get to chapter 33, and I just pay attention, please, to what it says in verse 1 through 3. It says, Now Jacob lifted his eyes and looked, and there was Esau coming, and with him 400 men. So he divided his children among Leah, Rachel, and 2 maidservants. And he put the maidservants and their children in front, and Leah and her children behind, and Rachel and Joseph last. If you were Jacob and you knew that Esau hated you and you were scared for your life so much that you ran away, and you saw Esau after years of not seeing him, and he's got 400 guys with him, you'd probably be scared too. Jacob's so scared that he divides his company, in a couple of segments, and he's worried about what's going to happen. So you read what it says in verse 3. Then he crossed over before them, and on his way of seeing Esau, look what it says, verse 3, he bowed himself to the ground 7 times until he came near his brother. And another thing he did, if you continue reading on in the context, it almost like he sent gifts to him. And Esau recognized him. He asked him, why did you send these gifts? And Jacob's response was, so that way I could find favor with you. So he sends gifts. He tries to give Esau things. Before seeing Esau, do you read what it says in verse 3? He bowed himself 7 times. If I were to ask you what kind of person that Jacob was trying to be here in a Bible class setting, the answer I'd be looking for is Jacob was trying to be a servant. I don't know if you understand that there, but Jacob was trying to be a servant, bowing himself before his Lord, as he says later on in the context, trying to give him what was his and give it to his master. That's the idea. He was being a servant. And if you read what it says, verse 4, did it work out in his favor? But Esau ran to meet him and embraced him, and he fell on his neck, and he kissed him, and they wept. Yeah, it definitely worked. So this idea of humbling yourself to another person, this idea of trying to be humble so that way you can fix a relationship, help a relationship rather than destroy it, yeah, it definitely works. But here's the issue. It's really uncommon that people have this kind of attitude. I want you all to think about this very seriously. Think about it in your own lives. If you look on screen, you see a very happy picture. Very pretty picture of the night sky. A lot of stars, a lot of good stuff there. I'll tell you one last story. Teddy Roosevelt, I'm not sure he was the most humble guy, but he was definitely one of the more influencing presidents of our lifetime. One thing that I really like about Theodore Roosevelt, though, is that he loved natural beauty, and he tried to, I think he started the national park system, basically. Anyways, story goes that he would invite, diplomats, leaders of states of foreign countries to dine with him, so that way they could make plans, they could make decisions that would basically run the world at the time, since he was the president. Well, from my understanding, he was known to have these dinners with these diplomats, talk about very serious things, make those decisions. And then after dinner, he would take them outside on his balcony, and they would he would tell them, all right, look up to the stars, look at the sky. And so they would see something like you see on screen. And then he would tell them, just do that. And they would do that for several minutes. And then he would say to them, all right, guys, I think we feel small enough now. I think we can go to bed. His point was, when you look at the sky and you understand that you're not as big as you think you are, who people think you are, you become humble. In Theodore Roosevelt's mind, okay, now you can go to bed. So you look at what David said in Psalm chapter 8, verse 3 and 4, when I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon, the stars, which you have ordained, what is man that you are mindful of him? This was the greatest king, in my opinion, in the greatest country at the time, greatest country to have ever been. And he thought to himself, what is man that you are mindful of him? Addressing God, what is the Son of Man that you visit him? My advice to you, my humble advice to you, is to consider your smallness, how small you are before God. Let that be your driving force to humbleness, instead of letting pride excel in your life. All right, thank you so much for your fine attention this evening. If there are any questions or comments, feel free to chime in at this time.
Thank
No problem. I don't know who that was. I heard her thank you. So I can kind of hear you, David.
Cynthia is on. I just wanted you to check with her and see, get an update on Jack.
Okay. Miss Cynthia, I don't know if you heard that, but David Sullivan was asking if you had an update on Jack. How's his recovery been?
Maybe next time.
Yeah, maybe next time. If I'll shoot her an email, and then I'll try to get back to y'all. All right. Any other questions or comments? Oh, Ed's trying to get in. He's right here. Any other questions or comments? Ed, did you just come in for the last second of it? I don't know if you heard that. All right. Well, thank y'all for y'all's fine attention. Lord willing, I will see y'all on Sunday. All right.
Thanks, Benjamin.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Ben.